fifth grade. Really ain't no difference if that nigga gay.
Blood satellite.
I read this book that I think you'll like a lot, and a lot of people will like, because I love this book. It's called Coup d'etat, a Practical Handbook by Edward Luttwak.
Already love it.
So, yeah, look, it's a book. It's not even the longest book. It's around, 200 pages and change. And this is the type of book I love because it's no nonsense. Every single page has got something interesting, and it's very condensed. That means it doesn't spend a lot of time repeating itself and trying to, hammer the point home. This is, for all intents and purposes, how you would conduct a coup within, and it gives historical examples from within a variety of governments, a variety of nations, many cases across time up until the present day, including one that happened in the mid 20th century in France. A lot of people forget about that. Oh, a coup is something that happens in an ancient society, or it happens somewhere in Africa. It's like, no, there's been coups in France, or attempted coups. And we're not even talking about Mishima. We're not even talking about very funny Japanese ones. We're talking about real ones. We'll get to talking about Mishima at some point in the future, I think. Yeah, when it says a practical handbook, it actually lays out step by step, here's how you could conduct a coup. Now, that's not to say that it's easy. So I think, when we talk about this with this, what will eventually be a clip, be sure that we're not saying like this is something you can do. No, it's not. To do it well, it's not really anything anyone can do. And if you try to do it, if a listener tried to do a coup, they would fail and it would be funny, which is what happened with Mishima. So if people don't know, the character I'm talking about is a Japanese guy. He's a poet, he's a writer, he's an author, and he was a revolutionary called, his name was Mishima. I'm trying to get his first name here. The fucking article's not loading. But he famously tried to, far right guy, liked to work out, liked to tan his balls. And Yukio Mishima is his name. Okay. And then he tried to hold a military coup, and then nothing happened, and he killed himself. He committed seppuku in front of everyone after no one wanted to join his coup. So that is what happens if you're an individual and just tries to do a coup on a lark, and then it fails. And then that's kind of the story of you. But I'll give some information here about what I mean. So what is a coup, first of all? Because there's a lot of different types of revolutions and revolts. So a coup is a revolt of the internal state apparatus against the central leadership. Now that is different than this thing called a pronunciamento, which is the officer corps revolting, or a putsch, which is, associated with the Third Reich, is just a division within the army revolting. And a liberation is a foreign army intervention. And then the insurrection is setting up a parallel state within the society and waging a war. So a coup is different than all these things. It is essentially the apparatus of the state trying to take control of the center. And when we talk about in the past, de Juvenel's high-low versus middle, you conceptualize society as three concentric circles. At the center, you've got, the central core leadership, and every nation has this. Then you have the sort of the bureaucratic institutions on the second circle. Outside of that, that's the machinery of the state. And that's where you get cops too. That's where you get the media. That's where you get the military, all just kind of the thing that makes the state. And then on the third circle, on the outside of that, you get the people. And the people can be subdivided into a bunch of different groups. So like you see a lot of the time in what you see with revolutions, sometimes it's that second circle, the apparatus of the state, using the people against the center. And sometimes you'll see the center use the people against the middle. So you can actually conceptualize that as Black Lives Matter if you wanted to, that they see the machinery of the state getting too cocky and having a bit too much sovereignty. And so they need to break it down and take away some of that power. So you can use the people in these internal conflicts to check each other. But so a coup would be that second circle of the machinery to say that would be the military, that would be the police, maybe with the media, taking out the central party, that would be taking out like the president and just assuming control. And that's where you'd see like a general taking over. That's usually what it looks like. And I think the key is that typically has to be the military. Like, you need the military. It doesn't even make sense if it's anything but the military. You know what I mean? So the idea of leading a revolution just from the people without the assistance or buy-in of the military in some way, I don't think that happens, especially in a Western nation where the military is quite developed. And we'll go into how that actually happens. And so, and in a modern coup, actually, it can only happen because we can draw a distinct line between the central authority and the state. We have this thing called the state that can kind of be a free-floating thing, because traditionally there was no difference between the central authority and the state. It was mostly hereditary, and you actually get this in places like Saudi Arabia still, where you can't draw a distinct line between the family, the dynasties that actually occupy these things. It's only really possible once you have these hard lines where anyone can kind of occupy the center. And then, the military isn't run just by your cousins and uncles and shit. And what the coup tries to do overall, like if you had to summarize a coup in one little line or sentence, it's like the coup is trying to get the machinery of the state in line so that when they strike, there is no opposition. That's what it is. That's why when a coup is forming in the initial stages, what you're trying to do is make it so when you march on the palace or the White House or Parliament Hill or whatever it is, you actually don't need to fight. You won't have cops. You won't have police. You are the military. And if there are any internal military units who are against you, they're either on your side or neutralized. Not killed, but just neutralized. So by the time a coup happens, it's like a blitzkrieg. It happens within a day. Boom, you show up. No one knows what's going on. They just, once the smoke settles in 5 minutes, there's a new guy on TV. Like, what the fuck? So you'll never actually see a coup coming, or most people won't. There might be organizations within the state that kind of know about it because they're all, especially now, if you want to do one now. But for the average person, it'll be like a lightning striking, and then all of a sudden they're like, "Yeah, the new guy's gone. Don't worry about him. He's gone. Shut up. Get out of here with that. I don't know who you're talking about. It's me, Generalissimo. It's me, Hitler. I'm back, baby."
The best coup.
Pointing his fucking hand at the camera. I'm back, baby. I'm the
YouTube,
Joker, baby.
Doing the YouTube affectation. He's got like the ring light around the screen reflecting in his eyes, waving his hands and just gesticulating.
Got one of those smart lights behind him. Hitler's back, baby. All right. And sometimes, and what's interesting on the hereditary thing, that a lot of times a hereditary leadership can be ended by coups. And we've seen this all the time, where military will destroy like a dynasty family. But you can actually reinstall a hereditary line, which I think is what you're kind of seeing in Syria with Assad. Because in Assad and Syria, there was like a dozen coups before Assad got there. And now I think you would be hard pressed to find a guy who couldn't just like put his, progeny in line. You establish like a family name, and that's kind of what the Clintons tried to do and failed. But, some people like that. It's not so once a dynasty falls or a important aristocratic family falls, you can bring it back, because it turns out once you uncork the bottle of a military coup, they can just keep going forever, and people get tired of that after a while.
Yeah,
you don't want coups to become normal, because then people are like, "I will just give me a king." That's kind of what we're at in the West, where it's we kind of see these coups. That's I don't want to give too much credit to Trump, but the phenomena of Trump was interesting because he was waging a war against the deep state. I do think he was in many ways a populist president, perhaps the last one. But we know from the start, the machinery of the state was against him. And that was open. That wasn't even secret. It wasn't the media was against him. The intelligence agencies, everyone was against him. And then I think they ousted him. I don't think there's any other way to look at it. And then because he was a new guy, they didn't want to. They're not going to allow a Trump dynasty. They're not going to allow that sort of thing to happen. And I think in America, everyone kind of knows this, that the machinery of the state is so developed. You can't elect a single person to change it. Mm-hmm. There is no real center in that sense. Like it's a new beast. I won't get too much into that, but like if you wanted to have a coup in America, how the fuck would you even do it?
Yeah.
America, just the way, no matter what you think about America, I'm not an anti-America, but let's think, like, how would you, even with the support of a lot of the military, like, the intelligence agencies are so well developed that even the military might lose to America's own intelligence agencies, the way that it's set up, and where so many of these intelligence agencies have their own guns too, it's historically unprecedented. So I don't know why I'm leading with this. This should be at the end, but really think about that. If you wanted to, is America impervious to a coup, at least in the traditional sense? I don't think you can't seize the media for sure. It's too amorphous. It's like a blob. Anyway, and this is something we actually saw in 1958. A man named de Gaulle. We saw that this happened in a democratic system. So this is something that didn't go through in his case. But it's like they think it can't happen in a democracy. It can't happen in a modern nation. Of course it can. They try. Sometimes they fail. But one of the ways it gets there, which is why I think the stage is set for something like that now. I don't think it's practically possible, but we'll talk about that later. Is usually a coup happens when certain criteria are met. It's like severe or prolonged economic crisis, a long and unsuccessful war, and chronic instability under a multi-party system. That sounds like now, and people will say, "Oh, that's all the time." No, it's not really. I think it's more now than it was in the 50s. So when a coup is more than possible because people are looking for stability more than anything. They actually want someone in charge because people keep losing. America keeps losing and shit, and people are upset. And you could say it's a civil war, but the stage is set in a lot of ways, I think, for some kind of coup or some kind of hijacking. The only reason it doesn't, it might be, is that the American state apparatus is such a fucking mess. And he goes in the book and there's something like 20 different intelligence agencies in America, which is like, if you wanted to have a coup in the 1800s, yeah, here you have to deal with the FBI, the CIA, the NSA, and there's like 18 to 17 or 18 others of like all these different agencies that have like $1 billion each allocated to them that kind of police each other, but are always just listening, and you can't get them all. I don't think it's possible to get them all, so I don't know how you would do it here. But and like I said before, and you'd need to get them on your side because a coup in its execution needs to be fast and anonymous, and before the opposition has essentially a chance to gather their senses. And so how you would move the pieces where you can create that much fog around what you're doing. Like I'm open to suggestions. I don't know how you would do it in this thing. And what's interesting is he says, I think this is correct, a coup needs to appeal to the existing elite and you need two things from them. You need to either they support you or they do nothing. And that's kind of a line I really want to lead with also with this book, is that when you're conducting any sort of political operation, you think you need to convince everyone to be on your side. You actually don't. You need to convince them to do nothing. And that's good enough. And he says this later in the book when he's laying out, like, if you're trying to find allies in the army, and we could say any organization, but let's use the army as an example. He will say, you'll be surprised at how many people will choose to stay neutral. So you don't actually need their money or their vocal support. You just need assurances that when I do this, you'll just be over there. And that's good enough. And he says you might have 60% of the military that are willing to do that. So, and they can keep their hands clean. So all you need in a lot of ways to pull things off is guaranteed neutrality. And you'll notice that everyone notices that in politics, that most people just go along to get along. You won't get any opposition from the majority of people in a Western nation. They'll just go along with whatever is on TV. And they don't really want to think about it. So really, when you talk, a coup is just an extension of democracy. And anyone who understands democracy knows that, it's just this thing I hijack. It's the easiest thing in the world to hijack, and people have the illusion of choice, but they really just go along with whatever elites are in charge. So, if you're conducting a coup, And this will be different for every nation, by the way. This will be different in China versus Vietnam versus South America versus Japan. You'd have to identify if there's any important dynasties. Here's another thing you need to look at if you're trying to hold a coup: unions. And there's cases in the book I'll get to later where it's like they hold a coup, but they didn't have the support of the unions. And the unions in that country, if it's a very resource heavy country, ground the economy to a standstill because they didn't account for them.
Yeah.
And in America, if you're trying to hold a coup, it's like you might need to account for the media more than you think, because they are essentially an ideological union. So if you need to like get them neutral, get them on their side, or trick them in such a way where you kill them after. That's essentially what he's saying. But they have anyone who has power to create problems for you, and whoever has power to create problems will be different in every nation. It's quite easy in agrarian nations. It's easier in a nation where it's just you got a bunch of mines. You can do that in a second, especially if people are dumb and illiterate. Like, forget about it. That's another reason I think it'd be hard to do in the West, but people can debate about that. He says like a stupid and disconnected people are easier to wield by a violent minority for a coup, and they will become docile after because it's still, they still have a sense of themselves. They don't really care who's in charge. That's kind of what communists do that I think is a clever sleight of hand the Marxists do, that they create this false narrative that they're all together. And that's how you could have the Soviet Union, where you still ended up with elites, and they created this kind of facade that they weren't.
And it also makes sense that in that case they were preying on the poor and illiterate, right? Like you kind of have to play democratic games with an educated population, but with the poor and illiterate, you can just promise them, "Hey, I'm going to feed you. Don't worry about it."
Yeah. And to hold a successful coup in the modern sense, he points this out, is that if you're a developing nation, so not like one of the big Western ones, but a developing nation, maybe in the Middle East, maybe in South America, it's actually impossible to have a coup in the modern day without the support of a larger country. That would include America, China, or Russia. Those are the big three you would think of. But then when you do that, you become a vassal state to that country. So a coup, if you are in South America, you need to have some coordination after to try and make your nation independent. Because we've seen this time and time again, how many coups have America, backed? And they back them because they're saying, "Oh, I'm kind of buying a new colony with this."
Yeah.
So that's good for America. That's good for the big nations that do it. But if you are in the shoes of these smaller countries, you need to figure out a way where I'm going to get your support, but then I'm going to figure out a way to sever myself from you. And maybe that's what Cuba did. Cuba, there's cases where that's been done successfully. And what are they going to do? So, and he also says, like I said before, the members of the coup should be taken from the military itself to know how to execute fast. And that's kind of why the military is useful, because, revolutions and revolutionaries like to pull, Marxists love to do this, by the way, pull from the riffraff of society. Especially in America, leftist revolutionary movements loved recruiting from prisons. They love getting gangs involved. They love getting just anyone who's the detritus of society. And there's like, well, that you're kind of guaranteed to fail with that. That's why revolutions that have a populist tilt never actually succeed. Even Castro's revolution in Cuba, as a great example, like he was a military guy. He has military guys in the fucking mountains. And they kind of moved in from there. And then after the revolution, we've talked about this before, everyone kind of pretends that they were part of it. And you can forward that fiction as much as you want, but realistically, if you buy that lie that a revolution requires like a populist uprising, no, it doesn't. You actually need to get very tricky with elites. You need to get very tricky with the military and the existing power structures, and this is actually what the Marxists and communists did. The Bolsheviks actually did this. They're a lot more cunning than people give them credit for, given their place in history. But the fiction that it was just the people rising up against the state, like that's not what happened really. There was a lot of preliminary stuff where they had to figure out where their allies are, figure out how to neutralize certain parts. Of course, like why wouldn't it? This is why. And if I think the fiction that for a revolution to be legitimate, it must be populist and must exist away from the state. I think that's what sabotages them, to be honest. Now, there's going to be some people who really rise up against that. I understand, because it'll sound like, oh, he's talking about elite theory. He's talking about making friends with our oppressors. I'm like, no, oppressors are oppressors, but really, look at what the left likes to act like it's winning. It's not. Anarchists like to talk like they're winning. They're not. They end up setting up Chaz and Chop and these little fucking zones of these hell zones and act like, okay, that's winning. And they're only there because the state has deigned it to be amusing enough to permit.
Yeah.
That's, anyway, I'm getting off on a whole other thing here. But that's why he stresses like the military, like get the military involved, because you're dealing with guys who know how to organize and strike fast. Whereas these other people don't. They actually don't know how to organize or strike. They think if they cause enough chaos, then things will just happen. But what you actually need is a surgical strike.
On the surface, Nairobi now gives an impression of order again, as it has done during the years of calm and prosperity following independence from Britain in 1964. Nairobi and Kenya have been models that other black states have tried to imitate, not always with success. On the morning of August 1st, though, the streets of the capital became a battleground. In the early hours, dissident Air Force units seized key positions in the capital and in other towns and called on the masses to help overthrow what they called a corrupt and oppressive regime. Within hours, loyal troops crushed the rebels and drove off an army of looters who had laid waste large areas of the commercial district. By midday, the worst of the troubles were over. The broken glass was swept away, and life officially returned to normal.
A coup is a surgical thing. It's not just when you see tanks rolling up to the palace, that's just the final masterstroke. All of the stuff was like the maybe years before that, where you're making a network of relationships and having secret fucking handshakes and this entire little mini apparatus you had. He says, even within the military, we can break down how much of the standing forces could practically pose a problem based on transport or training and deciding where the decisions are actually made. Basically says, if you're planning a coup, decide what forces can respond within 24 hours before the coup is finished. Because there's a lot of parts of the military that can't functionally oppose you because they're too far away, they're too disorganized, whatever. You look at, okay, what can cause problems within 24 hours? By the time we move in, take control, boom, it's done, it's over. So now it's up to you. Do you want to wage a protracted war against your own civilians, or do you want to just say, okay, what's next?
Mingling with the rush hour traffic, Red Army armored personnel carriers on the streets of Moscow this morning, heading to the Kremlin. They first moved in at 4 a.m., the first sign of the coup d'etat that removed Mikhail Gorbachev from power. With tanks in Red Square, the official word from the new government, calling itself the National Emergency Committee, was that the architect of glasnost and perestroika was too ill to continue in office. A short statement reminiscent of the Soviet Union's past was broadcast by state television. And with Radio Russia and Russian television prevented from giving independent information, leaflets were soon pouring out of the Russian parliament's windows to give people the latest news. The nation's new rulers didn't appear in person until late afternoon. They called a news conference. Gennady Yanayev, the man who until yesterday was Mikhail Gorbachev's vice president, confirming the transfer of power and saying Mr. Gorbachev needed time to rest.
And you're not trying to be a despot. You're like, I'm here now. It's too late. So what do you want to do? Do you want to have a bunch of people get blown up with tanks? And then they'll usually say no. Also, because you've probably got like a general up there who they already respect. You have elites. You have people within the systems that are already trusted. And he actually makes a point. He's like, in a coup, you actually need to decide who you want to kill afterwards and who you want to arrest. And he's like, it's very important. Don't kill any ceremonial figures, especially if it's an emperor or a king. Because in a lot of these nations like Japan, the emperor was more or less ceremonial. They really liked the emperor, but a lot of the decisions were made elsewhere. It's like, so if you stage a military coup, like in America, like you wouldn't want to assassinate the Supreme Court. You don't want to assassinate. You can't attack these things people believe in, even though they're just kind of ceremonial and don't even really fucking matter. But you want those to say something. Say, okay,
right? Because
really
you don't have any. you don't have any power that exists unto you. Like the whole point to this is you've spent years shoring up power through agreements and negotiation with other people who do have power. And likewise, like if you were to kill the Supreme Court, then you've just undermined all of your work. If you were to, to kill the emperor, you've undermined all of your work, because what you've done is you spent years convincing the emperor and the Supreme Court to ignore what you're doing while you do it. Right. So it does make sense that there would be as little killing as possible.
Yeah. And what you want to communicate to people, and this is a big thing, is that nothing's really changing. Like when a coup is done, once you've stormed, you've taken power, it's like, all right, guys, we're all good. And you actually do need to establish very, very quickly, if you pull off a coup, that this isn't an invading army. That's what people will assume, because people don't know. They're just, what the fuck? There's tanks. You're like, no, wait, it's me. It's us. This isn't, because then people will start freaking out. You're like, no, it's us. Everything's your life's not going to change, actually. So don't worry about it. And people are like, okay. The irony is, like, what you're selling to people is stability and change. So you're not saying like, we're going to make everything better now. You're telling them, no, everything's cool. Don't worry about it. Go back. Shush. And if you are arresting people, the people you arrest will be like the inner guys, loyalist forces. So that's part of the preliminary coup thing. You want to identify who's on your side, who is going to be neutral, and they don't really give a shit. Cops are like this too. He said you got to identify the cops. 9 times out of 10, cops aren't going to give you any trouble. However, there are some police members who are diehard loyalists. So you actually need to send out feelers and figure out who's actually a loyalist to the regime. And you might not even need to kill them, but some you will, because they will tell you that if you better kill me now, because I will come for you, like the president's right-hand man. And you got to fucking figure out who that is. Ironically, I gotta stop saying ironically, because I don't think this is ironic, but in America, you might not have a lot of loyalist forces to anything. You might not have anyone who's really willing to die for a guy. You might have that with Trump, actually. But is anyone in the Democrats going to die for Biden? Are they going to kill for Biden? I don't think so. I think that Biden is just like a birthday mask the fucking machinery of the Democratic Party put on while they do their thing. But anyway, you could actually tear apart the American machine a lot easier. But it's just a fucking mess. And this is why the cops, you have to infiltrate the cops, infiltrate a lot of these machineries, and kind of turn them on your side, or at least make them confused. And he actually breaks down how you should start recruiting in the book. And he says in the beginning phases of recruiting, you actually want them to be important but expendable. So you actually want to sound people out and kind of introduce them. This is like spy stuff where you start talking to guys. And these guys might turn you in. If they get the feeling, you don't know whether or not they're in for a coup until you actually talk to them. So you want a guy who's got some clout, but someone where you're willing to let him go if he gets arrested and just pin on, like, that's the guy who's trying to plan the coup. Like, what? That's fucking crazy. Who would want to do that? And then what you're selling the elites on, you're not selling the people this. What you're selling the elites on is on an attitude and change rather than specific policies. And this is the genius of a coup, is that you're actually trying to unite people that don't actually really agree, and you're keeping things vague. He's got a whole part here. He said you can't really unite a group along identified divergent lines. This is the trick. So if certain groups hate each other, you can't unite them on that. You have to kind of introduce a new sort of unity for them, because everyone needs to be united on something in common for a coup. And it can't just be the hatred of the regime. It can't just be, I hate this guy. It's got to be something, but it also needs to be vague at the same time. Like if you start listing policies in a coup, forget it. But what you're trying to do is you're trying to tap into something deeper in people, which is hard. It's hard for liberals to do, because liberals don't believe in that, and leftists don't really believe in that, or they believe in like a deep class consciousness that doesn't exist. But to get like all these different groups that maybe don't like each other on your side and part of this movement, or at least accepting of it, you need to like play a bit of sleight of hand with them, where it's like, we're bringing back the glory of the nation, but you're not getting specific on what part of the nation's history you want to return to. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
He says in the modern world, ethnic rivalries and tribalism actually maximize once the currency of conflict is more than land and more abstract. He's got like a point here. He's like, as old conflicts widen in scope and intensity, the instinctual solidarity of the ethnic groups harden. African tribalism is merely an extreme case of a very general phenomena. For example, sophisticated and utterly unreligious Jews will happen to marry other Jews, though they may regard themselves as thoroughly assimilated. I don't know about that. When there was still a Czechoslovakia and communists to boot, despite Czech and Slovak Protestants of national unity, capital investments had to be assigned carefully to each area on an exact percentage basis, as conflicts over this was one of the factors that brought down the government of Antonin Novotny in 1968. In fact, all over the communist Eastern Europe of those days, the old rivalries and enmities were just below the surface, and the new socialist national policies of the later 1960s and 1970s vigorously revived them. In Romania, almost 500,000 Germans and 1.5 million Hungarians felt that they were not getting a fair deal, while in Yugoslavia, Croats, Serbs, Bosnians, Albanians, Macedonians, and Slovenians were all involved in a complex balancing act that ultimately broke down in bloody civil war. So what he's saying is that, even in these socialist countries where you're trying to unite people on like the working class or us versus them, you still have these ethnic rivalries emerge, and that is something you need to grapple with in a coup. That's why like appealing to ethnicities in a coup is so difficult, and I don't think you can even really do it, because a new regimes after a coup can pull from minorities to turn against the majority. Like you can use the minorities, but only as like a chaos agent in a sense, And this is, he actually warns against this. He says, look, when you're trying to form a coup, and we've talked about this before on the show, like if you're trying to start any movement or any group, you need to delineate very carefully between people who want to start a new system and those who are just anti-system. And he says, like, look, even if you're pulling from the military, anyone who's been in the military will tell you, especially in North America, like there's some people in the military that are just violent retards.
Yeah.
And I bet anyone who's been in the military is listening to this can name me 3 off the top of their head. Guys they met in the army, in the service, who are just fucked in the head. Especially maybe if you've served active duty with them. Like, you'll know. And so he's like, you actually need to be... You can get these guys easily. You can get antisocial people easily. But he's like, you actually don't really want them, because they will also turn against you later, and they will cause problems all along the way. So he's also talking about, like, if you're looking for disaffected groups to turn against the majority, it's like, okay, be careful, because you might just need to kill these people after, which is something that happens in coups and revolutions all the time. It's no surprise that after a successful revolution, they start shooting people. Yeah. Bolsheviks did this. Hell, the fucking Hitler did this. Like, they're useful to a point, but the nature of their rebellion that they have means that they probably won't even see this coming. And actually, I wanted to give you another line here. He's talking about how the French coup I was talking about failed because the military forgot the political forces. This was in France, where it was a bunch of generals in Algeria kind of waging a coup against the French government. He said, while the leaders of the coup started to gather support, the French defense minister was on a trip to Morocco. Maurice Papin, the head of the Paris police, was on vacation. Everything was all set up. Everything pointed to an early victory in the coup, and yet a few days later, General Chalet was being flown to Paris for eventual trial and imprisonment. Why did the coup fail? Perhaps the main reason was that the 4 generals had utterly neglected the political forces and had allowed the immediate power of the armed forces to obscure the somewhat less immediate but ultimately decisive role that they could play. In the Gaullist coup of May 1958, the action of the military and the population of Algiers had been supported by the Gaullist infiltration of the civil forces and by the steady corrosion of the will of the other political groups. This time, the generals had simply ignored the civilians. De Gaulle, the guy they were trying to depose, went on television and asked for help from the population. Français, aide-moi. Debray, who followed him on the screen, was more specific. Go to the airports, convince the soldiers who are misled. So the effect of this refusal was decisive. The larger part of the wait and see element of the armed forces, remember that we're talking about the neutral people, that element stopped waiting and declared support for the existing prime minister. So if you forget the fact that you actually need, if you look at the nation you're trying to throw a coup on, you actually need to take an appropriate accounting of the forces at work. So, if you're in the military, you think, oh, I can just walk in there and take over. But you didn't take into account how in a modern era, it's easier to reach the people with mass media and the role the journalists play in that. And they didn't expect that such a political force could stop a military. And it did. I think that's something that's interesting to think about, where hypothetically, if you wanted to have a coup nowadays, I mean, say, fuck the journalists, fuck journalists, sure, but you need to account for a united journalistic apparatus that can be totally turned against you, as Trump saw. We see what happens when a advanced first world media apparatus is targeted just against you. We know what that's like. You can't ignore that. And so that's why even the military, like, unless you're going to start shooting all journalists, and then you're going to lose in a different way. You know what I mean? Like, if you're just out there, if the military is just shooting everyone at the New York Times, like, you're done. You're lost. Like, that's not a coup. That's just a mass shooting, I guess. And he actually goes in here on that point, just to give you an idea. He lists in this book on page 60. This was crazy. The sheer amount of American intelligence agencies. Like, we have the CIA. I'm just going through the numbers here. There's 21 intelligence agencies in America. That's including like the National Ground Intelligence Center, the National Air and Space Intelligence Center, which is all different from the CIA, different from the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence of the U.S. Treasury Department, which is different from the Office of Intelligence and Counterintelligence. This is all still existing, which is different than the U.S. Military Cyber Command, which is different from Air Force Intelligence, the National Air and Space Intelligence, and then the U.S. Navy's Department. And all of these, they're not just like one office in a building. These have multi-million-dollar budgets, right? And these are all different intelligence apparatuses in league with journalists and in league with like other spies, essentially domestic spies. So, like, if you want to conceptualize a coup in a modern sense, remember that you are in a state where you can't just, you can't lead like a populist revolution. That doesn't even make sense once you realize the forces that work. And then secondly, you can't even lead a military coup because it's so advanced in the intelligence side. You might have a better chance, neutralizing the intelligence side and forgetting the military at all. Maybe if you just get them on your side, the military will just be so disorganized. That's what Canada is. If you want to have a coup, forget the American military. It's not doing shit. Convince CSIS. Just start with that.
Yeah.
And he makes a good point about military. Is like, traditionally, like a former army in like the 18th, 19th century, it's like, okay, if you neutralize 10% of the forces, you would neutralize 10% of the forces because it's just men with guns. He was saying the way the American military is laid out and the way it's organized, if you neutralized 1% of the forces, you might actually neutralize 30% of its functional capabilities because of the way we have specialists laid out. Like, instead of like trying to convince actual soldiers, you can convince officers. Okay. But then instead of just convincing officers, because officers are actually pretty hard to convince, you can look for like certain tacticians who are running like the intelligences. Like, you don't need to convince, like, a few drone operators would go a long way. So like the way automation works, and this is in every aspect of our society, if you just convince 10% of people, if you convince like a few guys at like air control, you could ground every flight in America.
Yeah.
It's actually, it's easier to destabilize like that. So he says, keep that in mind. And I guess we're going kind of long here, but there's a lot we can talk about this. I don't know if we'll get a lot to it today. And actually, on that last topic, there's a part here that I like. He said, in general, the more sophisticated the organization, the greater its efficiency, but also its vulnerability. Either skip that. For the forces, losing the cooperation of 10% of their personnel would mean losing approximately 10% of their effectiveness. In the case of 4C in this little line here, which is modern military, the loss of perhaps 1% of its men could lead to a total loss of effectiveness for some particular tasks, such as intervening in the capital city. This indicates that when we are trying to neutralize a formation of the armed forces, we should do so through the cooperation of technicians rather than leaders, because the former are both more effective individually and safer to recruit. Now that's interesting because, you think I got to recruit leaders, like maybe not. Maybe just need to have sort of like middle management technicians who are highly skilled, but aren't like the figurehead of, that's why officers are notoriously hard to get. But, forget officers. There's other vectors in the military you could convince. It sounds like we might get kicked off of YouTube for this, but this is just, it's history. Oh,
Yeah, it's observational. That's all right.
Yeah. Here's another case study that I liked a lot. This is about the power of unions and having to, like we were saying with the intelligence apparatus, look at how your state is actually run and figure out who can cause problems. So it says the experience of Bolivia after its April 1952 revolution, which upended the social order, illustrates how a single trade union and its activities can dominate a country's political life. Bolivia was the poorest country in all of Latin America, with an economy characterized by subsistence farming and the activities of the large tin industry. Before the revolution and the nationalization of the mines owned by Patino, Arayomo, and the Hochschilds family. Oh, Jesus Christ, Hochschilds? Even there? All right. The miners had worked in physical and economic conditions of extreme harshness. Following their emancipation, they naturally wanted to achieve immediate and substantial improvements in the conditions. It was soon discovered, however, that the geological and economic conditions of the industry required an increase in productivity, which could only be achieved by introducing much new machinery and reducing the labor force. As the only source of capital was the United States, the miners' leaders opposed the reforms on the dual plank of no Yankee capitalism and no redundancies. So even without the special basically, they stopped the coup. Like one fucking, and this is because they are like a subsistence country, but also a highly unionized country. So in that country, because the coup didn't account for the union causing problems, the union could actually wield the people against them. And that's what fucking sabotaged that coup. So, in Canada, like, look, we don't have unions like that. And the unions that we do have are a joke, but look at what social and political forces are there and what elites are there. Like, for example, like if you wanted to have a coup in America, you're not doing it without Silicon Valley. Now, I think if you wanted to go, and I was watching this recently, I was watching a couple shows. One was We Crashed about WeWork, and the other one was Super Pumped with Joseph Gordon-Levitt about Uber. And, once you watch these Silicon Valley shows, you do get the sense that, oh, these are the power brokers in America. These are the ones that exist in relationship to the government. Of course, they receive subsidies. Of course, they receive handshake deals with either state or federal government. But, they are like, forget a coup if you don't get Tim Cook and like these fucking retarded CEOs on your side. And hey, would it actually be more possible? Like, you look at these, like the CEO of Uber, he's a fucking goofball. He's like, high five, we're having meetings in strip clubs. Think about how you would convince a tech genius to join your coup to overthrow the government. That's a funny thought experiment, because you would need to, like, maybe the Koch brothers is one thing, but like, figure out how to get like celebrities, figure out how to get like, who's a big celebrity, Funkmaster Flex, for example, Professor Griff, how would you get Professor Griff on your side? Who's the big guy? Michael Shannon. How would you get Michael Shannon on side with your coup? And you can tell it's a good thought experiment because it also works as a bit. All good thought experiments work as bits.
I was trying to tie
that's a fork in the road.
Funkmaster Flex as your main guy, tying that back to Koch brothers, like you just get some Coke for brothers. I don't know, for black guys.
You can do it.
I don't know.
I have faith in you.
I'll come back.
Feel it
I'll
out.
come back with that one next week with a riff there. But that's all I got.
Take that one for a walk.
Okay.
We got Koch brothers. We got Michael Shannon. We have cocaine. Let's put that in the hopper for a while. See, come back and see what we get. And he goes into, what basically, like I said before, and as what he's doing is that once the coup on the evening of the coup, what you're trying to guarantee is confusion. What you're trying to do is, if you have certain units on your side, good. Once you start marching and once you start enacting this coup, you want to send out as much chaos as possible, give conflicting reports. People won't know what's going on. And this is important for the intelligence agencies, because the intelligence agencies, the entire time, they'll know what something's going on. They'll know generally people are talking. There might be a coup forming. But all throughout this time, you want to be feeding out false information, false leads, and just create a fog around you. And that's what happened the day of the coup. Like units that are far away will be like, what the fuck? They can't reach you in time. Then those who are there, the cops, they're not going to run around like with chickens with their fucking heads cut off. They don't know which way to go. Any other military, they'll find that there's roadblocks here. Who's in charge of this roadblock? I don't know. What the fuck? I can't move through here. Who's in charge here? You have a lot of people asking who's in charge here, and no one will know. And then by the time it's over, they'll be like, too late. All right. That's what you want. So chaos is actually good. And this is something that, agencies leverage against little upstart movements all the time. You can use it against them. It's actually quite easy to do that. And I won't go like too much into what to do the day of the coup, because really, I mean, I'm not a military guy. I'm not doing this. It will depend on what the military makeup is as well. We were joking before, like, I don't know what the American military is going to look like in 20 years. Like, it seems that the military is trying to sabotage itself in a way. So maybe that is a point of power centralization. That's one thing to look at, that the on-purpose sabotage of the American military with fringe people and all this trans stuff, and just the breakdown of efficiency and sheer maintenance of the stuff, is that serving some other power structure? We're essentially neutralizing the military's ability to rise up against the state. And so who does that benefit? Well, the CIA, the entire intelligence apparatus, for one. We joke about, the military turning into a joke at some point. I'm like, well, who's letting that happen? Who's encouraging that to happen? It's not necessarily the military. It's these other social forces, and the 20 various intelligence agencies who've already centralized their power. The CIA is doing pretty good for itself. No one's coming for the CIA. Maybe the CIA is coming for the military. Just like they're coming for local cops. They would love nothing more than for you to outlaw police. Outlaw the cops, because then the FBI gets to do everything. You think it sucks now? Wait till you have a federal police agency. The FBI. Jesus Christ. You're going to have because at least before you had guys connected to the community. Now you don't. And you think that's going to go better for you. Okay, sure. So that's pretty much it. Just explaining like what a coup is, how it works, and how to kind of get it started, and the issues that would pop up in the way. And that's why, like, if we wanted to do one in a modern, combat has changed so much that the sight of a military marching on something, it is kind of treated in this respect like it's just a show. It's kabuki theater. All the work has been done beforehand. That's true. So I'm trying to, we're not saying like, how do you get tanks into the Parliament Hill? How do you do this? No, the work happens beforehand. And I'm trying to figure out, like, how would you even go about circumnavigating all the intelligence agencies? And is the military in the future even a viable resource to pull from? I might be crazy. That might be a dumb take. I'll claim ignorance on that. I'm sure there's a lot of military guys. Thank you for your service. Tell me why I'm retarded. I say, yes, sir. How many push-ups? Tell me I'm a stupid faggot, sir. I'm saluting my mic right now. And then, like you said, there's after the coup, it's the stabilization. That's where you take care of loyalist forces and get everything back to normal. And usually, he talks about it like imprisoning them. You might very well need to kill them. But that's why when I hear guys like Academic Agent, who we talked about before, he had this mantra of clear them out. He's kind of talking about a coup. talking about like we need to clear them out, clear out the bad guys. Doesn't matter who, and in his mind he picked journalists. And I'm like, okay, I get that. I get why you would say that, but you're kind of trying to gather everyone together. It has the function of a coup. Like that is kind of what he's doing here by saying it doesn't, ethnicity doesn't matter, race doesn't matter, political affiliation doesn't matter. All we can do is get in there and clear out the machinery of the state. I'm like, okay, if you do that, you might actually be serving the centralizing power. Like if your only goal is to clear out journalists, that might actually help a larger power structure that maybe didn't like them anyway. Sometimes you have to wonder, like, if I'm allowed to pull this off, who am I helping?
Yeah,
that's who people should be asking.
Like
Ask yourselves that, like,
yeah,
why am I not being shot while I'm doing this? Really ask yourself that. that can lead to a downward spiral of paranoia. I understand, but also, sometimes think of that.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.